Friends, I have fantastic news. You all helped me ruin a homophobe's evening last weekend. I had the pleasure of guesting on The Atheist Experience with Tracy Harris, and that evening, on a totally unrelated thread, someone showed up to voice his displeasure with the fact that Tracy had a lesbian on The Atheist Experience, and it ruined his evening. This is a peak achievement and activism for me, and our patrons helped make it happen. So if you want to help me keep ruining homophobes' evenings, head over to patreon.com/thegaytheistmanifesto and consider a per episode donation to support our show. Nathan, Benjamin, and Justin are this week's homophobe phobes. Who's next? Your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. This is the Atheist Manifesto. Hello, dear friends, and welcome to the Atheist Manifesto. I am your host, Callie Wright, joined once again by my fabulous co-host, Ari Stillman. What's up, Ari?
Wow, what about that flat Earth, huh? You ever thought about that?
Stop it. Oh, my God.
You gotta do your research.
For those who don't understand the context, I had the pleasure of guesting on the Atheist Experience last weekend and had the displeasure of arguing with a flat earther, which is a thing I had no expectation of. So that was cool. He started his argument by saying, "So if we throw out gravity," and I'm like, "Wait a minute, is that a thing we can do?
Wait,
can we just throw out gravity? Is that what we're doing?"
That would have made physics class a whole lot easier.
Right, you know? So yeah, that was I wasn't expecting that one. It was basically the argument was because we know the Earth is flat, gravity can't be true, because if gravity were true, the Earth would be round. And there has to be an explanation for the planets and the sun and the stars being attracted to the Earth. And since we know it's not gravity, it's therefore God. That was the argument. So
well then.
Yeah. So that was an interesting conversation. So those of us involved in movement atheism have had a bit of a rough time lately, and that's kind of saying it politely. There's this, broadening divide of the social justice contingent of atheist activism and the older establishment atheism, and that's not necessarily new. And of course, it's more nuanced than that, but that's kind of the broad overview. And it does seem to have taken some particularly sharp turns lately. And of course, there was the BuzzFeed article about Lawrence Krauss, who was outed as doing some pretty terrible stuff, and was, until now, one of the more revered celebrities in the movement. And the reactions to that article by quite a few people and organizations was disappointing, to say the least. And frankly, I've been asking myself some pretty difficult questions lately about whether or not I want to continue to be associated with movement atheism in the wake of all of this. And for the purposes of this show, I'm not necessarily interested in making this show about bashing specific people or organizations or anything like that, because the problem's bigger than that. We definitely want to call out the bad behavior of people in groups, but I'm really interested in talking about the actions that we take past that. What do we actually do to create the kind of communities that we want to exist in? And obviously, we can all take steps on a smaller scale to curate our own communities to be the way we want them to be. But I'm also interested in what we do to create a systemic change. What are the right ways to apply pressure? At what point do we remove ourselves from the existing systems to do our own thing? I have so many questions on this. And to help us through these questions, we have invited two of the organizers of the Secular Women Work Conference to the show, Monette Richards and Stephanie Zavon. Welcome to the show, my friends.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having us.
So let's start with the basics here. Let's talk about the conference for a second. The philosophy behind what you're trying to do. What's going on in I don't even remember what city it's in. Total pro.
It's in Minneapolis.
Minneapolis, yeah. Totally pro podcast host here. I've done a lot of research, so.
Monette, if you're up for it, I think it's your turn to explain.
Sure. So we know everybody is already out there in the movement doing activist work because that's what a movement is, right? And anytime, usually the way these things get picked up is you have a person who sees something that needs to be done. And they say, wow, nobody's doing that. I should do this. And they start to do whatever activity it is to solve that problem. And they're learning as they go. They, a lot of the times they just come out of nowhere and, decide this is the right thing to do to fix this. So all throughout the movement, we have all these people who are learning things all over from the beginning all the time. So we thought, hey, let's get people who really know how to do this stuff together to teach the people who are trying to do this stuff the most effective and efficient ways to do it, and therefore making the entire movement better.
That's awesome. I love that idea, because one of the things that you deal with is trying to decide whether or not somebody is acting in good faith and making mistakes or being skeezy, right? And sometimes it's really hard to tell the difference. And like, I know I end up kind of apologizing for a lot, because it's like, well, most of these things are put together by people who are just really, really passionate about a thing, but they're not necessarily professional event organizers, right? And, nobody's getting rich off of this stuff. We've all got day jobs and lives, and it's just, I see a need and I want to go do this thing. I have no experience doing it. So like, of course I'm going to screw a bunch of stuff up along the way. And it's really like, you want to be really permissive around that, because you don't want to discourage people, but like, there is a point where you have to draw the line. So like, I love that philosophy.
Yeah, it's really, why keep going through everybody reinventing or relearning the wheel every time when there are so many people in the world who are willing to take the time to show them. So yeah, it's when I first started organizing lobby days 6 years ago, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I wanted to set up a lobby day, and I did it. And the first year was kind of hilarious. 6 years later, I've got it down pat, and I've got all of the, lessons that I've learned the hard way through the years. And it sure would have been a lot nicer had I had, any information at my fingertips to be able to run with that initially.
Stephanie, you have anything to add?
I'm just thinking back to the first Secular Women work. I had helped run 2 conferences already as part of Minnesota Atheists, just regional conferences, general atheist interest. And putting together something like this, even with that, we learned so much doing it that first time, putting all of this together a second time with templates, with not just budgets, but our actual receipts from last time. Just, no matter how much you think there's still a learning curve. And so it's great to be able to get that out there. And also, I just want to bring up the other part of Secular Women work. People have probably noticed from the title that women is in there. That's quite deliberate. We have been working for years to, frankly, convince the broader secular movement that the work of the women who are in the movement is actually worth something, and maybe even worth enough that, for example, we might want to protect them from harassment.
Controversial statement these
Weird.
days.
I know. So the conference, everybody who is speaking, everybody who's running a workshop, everybody sitting on a panel is either a woman or genderqueer, because frankly, if there's anybody who's going to get less listened to and valued than women in the movement, it's people who don't fit into a gender binary somehow. So we're putting all of that expertise on stage, and you know what? It's really not at all hard, because as it turns out, in the secular movement, like in most American life, a lot of the people doing your volunteer work with little thanks and no pay are women.
Surprise, surprise. And so I want to basically spend the rest of the conversation here kind of talking about activist philosophy, because anyone involved in organized atheism at all, I think, is probably at least somewhat been touched by recent controversies. And I'm not just talking about the Lawrence Krauss thing, because there's been a very long parade of them. And so, this is a conference that's doing a specific thing, trying to make a specific statement, and kind of doing your own thing, right? And something that I've been struggling with lately is the question of when you stop working within the existing systems. I think there is some value sometimes in continuing associations with people and organizations that may be problematic on some level, because existing in that space as the person exerting positive pressure can be a valuable thing. You can affect change within an existing system because the platform and the audience is already built in, and you can reach those people. But of course, there does come a point, I think, where things get so bad that you can't justify continuing the association, regardless of whatever possible good you may be doing. And I don't necessarily expect anyone to have an easy or a concrete answer to this. I think there's a very blurry line, a very wide and blurry line between those things. But I'm interested to hear both of you, either of you, talk through your thoughts on this topic.
Oh, my thoughts are really complicated on this. I should say I start from a point of being somebody who kind of works best independently anyway. So my first inclination is not necessarily to work with an organization, but at the same time, doing atheist activism, I end up working with lots of organizations. I'm currently associate president of Minnesota Atheists and on the board of Secular Woman. I've spoken at several conferences. I'm currently working with the Center for Inquiry on a legal issue. And I do that because, well, in part because I value expertise. Part of the reason we're putting on this conference. And I don't and can't have all of that expertise. I don't have the institutional memory. I don't have the same kind of resources, although we did kickstart the original Secular Women work because we wanted some independence. And so we said, we will either go into this with the budget that we want so that we don't have to trade that off to organizations for lack of control, or we're just not going to do it because we have a very specific vision for it, and we're kickstarting it again. But, at the same time, there are organizations that I'm not going to work with. I stopped working with and, in fact, started working against the James Randi Educational Foundation and TAM back when they kept inviting speakers like Michael Shermer, who they knew quite well. They had a history of claims of sexual harassment and assault as well, but it eventually came out that DJ Grothy, the head of JREF, had intervened to stop Shermer from groping somebody. So, but they still kept putting him on stage. And while doing that, attacked the whole idea of codes of conduct. So that's an easy no.
Right.
Some of the others aren't so easy. I mean, I have a long and complicated history with Center for Inquiry. The second Women in Secularism conference, Ron Lindsay stood up and introduced the conference by basically saying, now don't take this feminism stuff too far, ladies. And that was that was not an easy thing to figure out how to deal with. He ended up eventually apologizing under pressure from an awful lot of his employees, which made it easier again. But that's, it's a complicated relationship, and every time I'm deciding to do something with them as an organization, I have to think about what I'm managing to accomplish, what I might be undermining in terms of other progress. Currently we just spent a little more than a week and a half with them not saying anything about the Krauss allegations, with him being an honorary member of their board and a fellow at SciCop. And looking at the fact that, I'm working with their vice president who handles the legal side of things, wasn't really sure what I was going to end up doing there. Yeah. I gave them some time to figure it out because, boy, if anybody moves at the speed of bureaucracy, it's a big organization.
Sure.
But I really didn't know what I was going to do depending on what they did. Because if there's anything I'm particularly proud of in this movement, it's the fact that I helped persuade most of it to get codes of conduct into place. And going ahead and working with them could have undone all of that.
Yeah.
At least in an effective sense. So, yeah it's super complicated.
Yeah, well, and I've had to make those decisions before too, and I'm kind of in the middle of one of them at the moment, and I'm not gonna name names or anything like that because, like, I even struggle with the should we name names thing because obviously we want to call out bad actors, but the problems are I don't want to make it about this one organization because the problem's bigger than that, But there's an organization that I think made some bad decisions and did wrong by some people who are important to me, and then I've been invited to work with them in a specific capacity, and I'm thinking to myself, if I think of the thing that I am being asked to work with, I don't see anything but a positive result at the end of it. And the folks who benefit from that work had no say in the bad decision that the organization made. And so, I have an opportunity to go and add value to the spaces that these folks exist in and therefore make the spaces that they inhabit, in their local areas better. And so at the end of the day, it's a positive result, right? But at some level, participation is complicity, right? And I don't really know where that line is. And I don't want to feel like I'm saying fuck you to the people that they didn't treat very well, because I don't like that either. And that's something that honestly I'm gonna feel bad regardless of the decision I eventually make.
Exactly. And for this, I definitely will not name names, but there are several organizations where I have talked to people within them and helped them try to come up with strategies for changing their organization from within, because, while leadership often ends up presenting kind of a united front, there's a lot of back and forth disagreement within pretty much any of these organizations about how things should actually be done. Board disagreeing with employees, sometimes to the point where it gets where you have to kind of stop and think about how well the organization's going to survive. So, yeah. But I'm still, when I do that, how much change am I making? How, I'm not actually changing the leadership. They're still in place. They still have the same priorities. So even if I manage to do that, am I doing enough? And I don't know.
Yeah.
We're never doing enough, are we,
Never.
Stephanie? I mean, if we ask ourselves, to answer that question, we never are. I kind of look at it a little bit differently, in that, one, a lot of our members exist in these other groups as well. And two, these groups have been around, these organizations have been around for eons and have all the resources and all the establishment and all the foundation. And I would rather get them to change from the ground up than I would create our own thing and trying to start from zero. So it varies in which organization and how I will work with them, depending on what, nastiness they're involved in or whatever. But to me, I think I have a lot more that I can do when I'm working with them, I think is really how I want to put it.
Yeah.
And if I can do that and accomplish things without causing harm to any other people, then it's a win.
So we've been kind of skirting around this, and I'm interested in what everybody's thoughts are on this line that we draw when we decide, assuming that we want to change something, are we going to try and change it from within or change it from without? There must be a lot of factors, and I don't know that I can articulate exactly what those are. But if I think back to the presidential election, among leftists and progressives, there was a little bit of a fight about this. A lot of us voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary because we wanted to see that progressive change in the Democratic Party. And unfortunately, he didn't win that. So when it came to time to vote, do you want to vote Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, or maybe even Jill Stein? Some people went the Jill Stein route and said, I'm not going to work with the Democratic Party because they're too corrupt. And I don't think that we're going to be able to work within them to get the progressive policies that we want. So I'm going to vote for Jill Stein or maybe even somebody else. And we had others within the Democratic or progressive wing who said, Hillary is maybe not as progressive as I would like, but, at least if we get her in there, we can try and push her to the left and get her to make some changes in the way that we want if we work from within. But at the same time, nobody on the left is talking about going into the Republican Party and trying to reform them from within. Like we've acknowledged that we'll leave that to some other people within the Republican Party who might want to do that. But we're not wasting our time trying to infiltrate this completely opposing group from our viewpoints and trying to get them to change. So I don't know exactly what those factors are that cause us to decide whether this group is a lost cause and we need to work against them from the outside, or whether they're still salvageable and we should try and do that change from within.
I think the biggest consideration for me, and obviously there are a ton of them as you point out, but the biggest one is really, do I get attacked for trying to not even necessarily be friendly, but to be even-handed and just pointing things out in a neutral situation? I mean, that was what ended up happening with JREF is I said, look, there's a pattern of behavior here in your leadership. You may not notice this. It kind of looks bad. And well, the words outrage brigade weren't used, but that was basically what happened was, right. Oh, you're just doing this for the clicks. You're earning money off of attacking me. You're a professional rabble rouser. That wasn't the word used either. Nothing nearly as interesting as rabble rouser.
Right.
But that was the idea of even being able to take criticism on board was rejected outright. And unfortunately, that happens more than we'd like to see.
Yeah, and I mean, it's an age-old argument. I think anybody involved in any sort of activism understands the push and pull between, do we try to change the establishment or do we burn it all down and start over? And I mean, I think obviously there's a similar push and pull between, like, do we do what's practical, what we think we can accomplish, or do we continually shoot for the ideal? And I don't know. I tend to think that you can push for both at the same time. Yes. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
No, but I am. That's absolutely where I am in terms of politics is, declare what you want, be clear about what your final goal is, because that's how you make any of the intervening steps even thinkable. But don't necessarily reject small amounts of progress out of hand.
Yeah, well, and I had that argument on my Facebook page the other day because they were talking about, Dick's pulling assault rifles out of the Field and Stream stores. And, kind of where I was that day is like, well, it's a tiny, small, nigh insignificant step, and I'm not going to stand up and applaud them for it because it's entirely insufficient. And I got a lot of pushback saying like, well, even taking small steps in the context of this situation is huge. And I had to step back from that and be like, I mean, you're not wrong. But like, I feel like a thing that an activist eventually has to come to peace with, maybe, and I'm willing to be told that I'm wrong about any of this, but I feel like a large component of activism is holding your nose and doing a thing you don't necessarily feel great about to get the progress that you want. And I think there's always going to be the question of what's too far.
Yeah, well, and there's also the difference between, am I going to take this and try to build off of it, and am I going to throw a party?
Yes.
Everybody has their days, and don't tell people to celebrate everything if they're not into it that day.
Right. Yeah. Another big question that sort of jumps off of this one is when we talk about platforming and who we choose to have discussions with and who we choose to give space to. And I'm just going to say, honestly, I think there is more nuance to this question than is popular to acknowledge. Part of the defining line for me, obviously, is whether or not somebody's arguing in good faith. Like, hypothetically, if I found some alt-right anti-trans troll, but I got the impression that they were sincere in what they were saying and they seemed interested in a good faith discussion, I don't know that I have a strong argument that conversation shouldn't happen. Like, acknowledging, of course, like there are specific ways you want to handle conversations like that, but I can't dismiss it out of hand. And obviously the problem with that is that so often the folks on that side of things are the people who are the people who profit on outrage and sowing controversy. And you can't trust that anything they say is sincere. They're professional trolls, right? And that's an obvious don't engage, but like, there's also the idea of who's giving the platform to whom, right? Like, say, for example, Blair White, this like awful alt-right trans YouTuber, if she invited me to do a thing and I said yes, I could imagine people being like, what the fuck are you doing? But like, frankly, she has a platform far bigger than mine. And if we were doing literally anything together, she would be the one giving me the platform, right? Like, I'm not helping her out at all by having a conversation. So this is a thing that I struggle with too. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts.
Well, one of the biggest points that you hit on there, though, is in good faith.
Right.
And there are so many of them that are not even just not discussing in good faith, but just do it poorly anyway. So nothing you say is going to, it's all just going to bounce out into the atmosphere as if you never said it. But no, you bring up a really good point of, more of like power dynamics there and platforms. But, if you, I really hate to bring this up because I was kind of really hoping that MythCon 2 just goes under the radar without anybody even noticing that
Right.
it exists. But I mean, this year there are like 2 people I think who are going, who I think are going in good faith from like a progressive standpoint. Yeah. And I have to wonder if they know what they're getting into.
At least one of them was there last year, as far as I know.
Okay.
Which I mean, I'm not, generally speaking, unless something pretty egregious is happening, I'm not one to tell somebody else how to do their activism. I have questions. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Right. To me, I mean, yeah, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it because I would explode and set things on fire, I think, more than anything else.
Right.
But, so yeah, I don't know if that really got us anywhere in the discussion.
Well, I mean, the question is the crowd, right? The audience that you're doing it for, because I had the MythCon guys on the show before the last conference, and my worry was specifically that one, right? Like, am I giving these guys a platform when they don't need to get one? And I got some advice that I thought was pretty solid from a friend who said, well, the thing is you're having this conversation for the benefit of your audience, not the benefit of their audience, right? And that was a thing that kind of changed the calculus for me, because I'm putting it in the podcast feed. Generally speaking, the people who listen to the show are on our side of things. And if anything, what that was serving the purpose of doing is like, hey, this terrible thing is happening and I'm now motivated to do something to oppose it. I'm motivated to know that something is bad going on that I can try to stop or mitigate the harm of. If we were having that discussion on, a popular alt-right YouTube channel, like obviously, even if we had the exact same conversation, the impact I feel would be a lot different. So I think that plays a big part too.
And I would like to point out that particular show became like the de facto, oh, you want to know what MythCon's about? Listen to the show where they were on with Callie to see how bad it is.
Well, and I'd like to point out something specifically in relation to that show. And that is that a lot of times, particularly within the secular movement, when we're talking about giving somebody a platform, we are talking about a completely uncritical platform. We are talking about interviews where somebody has maybe read the book that the person they're interviewing wrote and doesn't actually have any background to pick out concerns about it. And the interviews end up being, as my husband put it, about the occasional questions that show up on Atheists Talk. How cool are you? Right. And and that's, even with a Q&A, that's honestly true of most of the talks we put on stage. There is not really anything set up to make sure that there is somebody there who can challenge what people say, who's prepared to follow up and say, wait a minute, you said this and now you say that, or you said this and you're doing that. Explain that difference. And that is an entirely different kind of platform. When you put like Charles Murray on your show, and you're not prepared to ask him questions about the construction of race and the construction of IQ as a measurement in psychology, you're giving him an uncritical platform from which to spew racism. And that I'm not going to be part of.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And what's funny is that's a question that I was convinced there was a very large and blurry line, and I actually don't know that I think you may have just changed that for me a little bit, because I was thinking through the prep that I did for all of that and all of the reading that I did. Like, generally speaking, I do a decent amount of reading. Like when I'm interviewing somebody that I don't know, whose work I'm only kind of familiar with, I definitely do my research. But I spent probably an entire workday's worth of research looking into, the problems with the people at MythCon. And, we ended up touching on like an eighth of the stuff that I read and watched. But yeah, I think that's an important thing too. When, if somebody's making a claim, you should probably be prepared to question its validity instead of being able to say like, oh, well, I guess if you're right, I agree with you, but I don't really know. Like that changes things a lot. So actually, that's a good insight. I appreciate that.
Just don't be a Dave Rubin. I think that's what we're all saying here.
Right.
I can get behind that. And I do want to say, there's nothing necessarily wrong with very friendly interviews, and it's something that atheists don't get a lot. But it changes the calculation on what kind of platform you're giving somebody.
I'm also interested in your thoughts on how these things play out in the context of social media, because I've been examining a lot the dynamics of how people interact in person versus how people interact in social media, and even in like over the internet, but not on social media, like in comment sections of blogs and that kind of stuff. And those things, there's some overlap there, but those conversations just seem to have an entirely different context in social media. And I feel like to some degree, when an argument is happening on social media, it's really, really hard for it to not become performative. And you're not just arguing and interacting with the other person, but it's hard to forget that there's an audience there and that there are people watching. And I feel like it's a really hard thing for that to not change the way you behave. And maybe I'm just projecting insecurities about myself onto other people. Like, I'm totally willing to be told I'm wrong about that. And I don't mean that I think it's a bad idea. Like, people shouldn't have conversations or argue on social media, because I do it all the time. But I think it's important that, like, I don't know, maybe there's like a training class or something like that. I don't know. Like, what do you think about the dynamics of doing these things on social media versus, talking to someone privately or trying to have in-person conversations where necessary, where there aren't like microphones and cameras around? I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, I would be happy to talk to a lot of these people who are out there calling me names. If they were willing to talk to me. And frankly, I get a lot of feedback from people who are like, oh, why are you criticizing this big name person? Why don't you just get together and hash it out? And I'm like, sure, you set that up, because they're
Right.
not people who think they need to talk to me. And that's why it ends up getting hashed out the way it does in public. And yeah, some of that is performative, because I know that that's going to be my opportunity to get my point across, and get my point across to as many people as possible about something I think is important, and also because I'm good at it.
That's key.
It is key. But it's not performative for the sake of performance, which
Right.
is kind of important to me. I mean, I do occasionally have those arguments on social media, but that's because I'm trying to stay awake or something.
Right. Well, and I'm not entirely convinced that performativity is entirely a bad thing either. Like, because a lot of times I think it's important to remind ourselves that if I'm having an argument with Troll A is probably not going to change their mind about the thing that we're arguing with.
But the audience
But exactly, there's a whole group of people who are not as entrenched on this and who are coming from the position of not knowing anything about the subject. And, in keeping that in mind, and in keeping it in mind, and when we're saying it's a performance doesn't mean that it's superficial. It's a different kind of strategy, I think.
It also doesn't mean that it's insincere.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Absolutely.
Like Stephanie pointed out, back when I first joined the movement, and there was a lot of the harassment online is not real, and we just need to buck up and all those kind of things. And everybody kept saying, you need to just sit down and talk it out, right? You just need to sit down with the people who are photoshopping pictures of you and calling you names and talk it out instead of this performative thing going on online. And what a kind of crock that is.
Yeah.
Or, when they would tell us, well, why don't you just call big name atheist on the phone and have a talk with them instead of talking about, going after them on Twitter? It's like, sure, give me their personal cell phone number. Oh, it turns out that's a really bad idea if somebody gives out some big name atheist personal cell phone number, apparently.
Right. Yeah. Well, and again, it's, you're the one who has the obligation to be nice to the person who's being awful. That was a situation that Ari and I directly ran into was, I was arguing with a third party about something having to do with racism, and a different guy entirely posted a picture basically calling me a fat, ugly, disgusting dude. And the expectation.
And you should totally have a conversation with that person, right?
Exactly. And that was the expectation, right? Saying something as simple as like, well, if you're still like friendly with this guy, I'm not entirely sure I can trust you anymore. Like, that was the extremist SJW nonsense, right? And I'm like, and I actually was convinced And I'm not super proud of this. And looking back on it, I kind of understand how it happened. But I was convinced that, like, well, you know what? Maybe there's a conversation to be had here. And we set up a phone call and everything, and the guy ended up never showing up for it because, of course.
I would have loved to talk to him too, but he preemptively blocked me before I even knew that he had publicly attacked me, and I had never spoken to him before. So hey, whatever. What am I gonna do?
But the onus is on us, right? Because we're the leftist, SJW, extremist, hyperbolic, whatever words they like.
Outraged.
Right, exactly. And so given all of that, you know, I'm not super proud of this, but I think we all have these moments. There's been more than once lately where I've gotten to the point like, fuck it, I'm going to find a video game I like. I'm going to sit my gay ass on the couch and forget the world exists. And
That's a really good idea, though.
It is. That's not something to not be proud about or, you know, to be upset about.
Well,
that's a perfectly reasonable and rational response.
My thought, though, has been to do that permanently. That's the part that I'm not proud of.
But you didn't. You did it long enough, though, to chill out and realize that, okay, you can get your head back in the game. And that's a very important thing to do. We have to be able to step back and go, you know, okay, I can't deal with people right now. I'm not going to deal with people right now. I'm going to take a break, and I'll be back when I can.
Yeah, and do either of you still find that something that's difficult to do? Because I go back and forth. Sometimes it's very easy for me to be like, you know what, I feel like I'm reaching my limit. I'm, you know, more irritable than is normal. I'm more tired. I'm lashing out more easily, or I'm withdrawing more. Like I kind of can step outside myself a little bit to a degree and sort of recognize that behavior happening and recognize that that's a sign of burnout or a sign that I'm pushing myself too hard. And it's very easy for me to be like, well, you know what? I'm going to put my phone on silent, set it across the room, and like watch Adventure Time for the rest of the day. And sometimes I find it incredibly difficult to do that. And I have a very long and complicated and drawn out conversation in my head where I convince myself, one, that I deserve that I deserve to be okay when, you know, the classic dilemma of like, well, there's so many people who have it worse than I am. Who am I to own that I'm struggling? You know, and I mean, that's a universal, I feel like that almost everyone understands that. And so, I mean, is this a thing that you all still find difficult? And is there a conversation that you have with yourself or ways that you convince yourself that this is an okay thing to do? I'm curious how that works for you.
I more or less drove myself into needing a medical break for a while. Now I have an anxiety disorder, which I have largely and unhealthily in my youth trained myself to get around by not paying attention to those kind of signals. Mm-hmm. So I have not only had to figure out that it's okay, but I've had to figure out ways to do it even when I'm not entirely sure that that's going to be a problem. So, yeah.
You just sort of train yourself to just err on the side of taking care of yourself?
Oh, hey, look, it's 8:00. If I don't stop and play some games now, I'm not going to sleep.
Right.
I should take a break. Okay, I'll do that.
When I do it, my kitchen will be spotless.
Yeah.
Because that's how I cope. Either that or I bake all the things.
Yeah.
Because again, anxiety, the only way I really managed to do it was I went on medication and I did nothing for months, and that upset me. So I had to go off of it because it killed any kind of ambition or desire to do anything at all. And I was still feeling anxious about things not getting done. So I probably could have taken the time to find a better medication. But I just decided, heck with it. Now that I have a name for it, I know it's called anxiety. I'm going to face it and deal with it and, you know, just go, hey, I'm feeling really bad right now. Well, that's my anxiety. So I find it very difficult. I'm getting better at it. And video games are a big help in knitting. Knitting, definitely. You know, my tattoo says knitting, not stabbing.
That's amazing.
It's my constant reminder of, you know, woe be to the world when I can't knit anymore. So But yeah, it keeps me stable and not yelling at people most of the time.
Yeah, I respect the hell out of that. That's good stuff.
And honestly, sometimes I just yell at people. It's not that hard to, if that's what you're feeling you need to do because none of the relaxing stuff is relaxing, it's not that hard to find somebody who would benefit from being given a reason to think twice the next time they want to throw their ignorant opinion on social media. Just not hard.
Yeah.
Right, because usually, the reason that we've got pushed to that point is because we've let other boundary breakers slide a lot. So sometimes throwing the temper tantrum or, whatever makes everybody else back off, and we can reestablish things for ourselves and get control, or at least feel like we have control again.
Another big pressure that I find myself under, and this is a conversation I've had several times with several people, is defining what your activism actually is, and this constant pressure to be the nice one who is patiently awaiting someone's changed mind while you accept all of the abuse that they hurl at you, and eventually, if you're nice enough, they might change their mind. And I found myself for the first time in a long time unapologetically asserting that at someone. It was a silly Twitter argument. Not that the argument was silly, but it was just someone who I didn't really have a lot of faith that they were going to listen. It was an argument about trans people, and it was like, biology says there's only two genders, bro. And my response is like, okay, so even if we allow that biology is coupled to gender, and it's not, but even if we allowed that it was, intersex people exist. So there's still an incredibly wide spectrum of experience on that spectrum. And he said something like, yeah, I know we want to play make-believe and 57 genders and ableist comment about your mental health. And I was like, gosh, it's adorable when somebody says, but science figures out they're wrong. And then the real argument comes out. And he's like, okay, but are you going to keep being mean to me, or are you going to address the real argument? And I was like, wait a minute. And I always wonder if this is conscious, right? Because that's gaslighting, right? I mean, he's telling me that I was the one being hostile to him and avoiding his argument when he just insulted me. And in the past, I might have felt pressure and succumbed to the pressure to, sorry, I got a little overly excited there. But it's like, no, you responded by insulting me and I responded in kind. You don't get to act like I'm dodging an argument. And there's value in that pushback, because changing hearts and minds isn't always the goal. Sometimes the goal is to get somebody to stop being a fucking troll.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Ugh.
Yep. Well, and why would you do that and personally attack them by showing them that their argument is wrong? I mean, that's so rude of you.
Right. Terrible. Yeah. So, I just keep convincing myself that one day we're going to have a conversation about activism that I come away and like, I've got the answers,
Dun, dun,
right? But
dun.
like, I'm not, that's not how this works. If that was going to happen, it would be people who are far better at it than I am, and it would have happened far before now. But I do always come away with really important insights, and I've gotten quite a few from this conversation. So I definitely appreciate you both.
Happy to do it anytime. I love talking activism.
Yes.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
so let's get down to brass tacks. Tell us when the conference is. Tell us where we can go find out more. Tell us where we can give the Kickstarter.
The conference is August 24th through the 26th. It'll be held on the U of M's West Bank in Minneapolis. You can find the conference at secularwomenwork.org. There are links there to the Kickstarter. You can also just go to the Kickstarter and search for Secular Women Work.
Awesome. Monette, Stephanie, thank you both so much for coming on the show. We appreciate your time and your
Thanks
insights.
for having us, Callie. And Ari.
Thanks for having us.
I'm here too.
And that, my friends, and Ari is here.
You've been so quiet.
That, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto. If you like what we do here and think these conversations are important, please share this episode around on the Facebooks and the Twitters and the social medias in general. We are a proud member of the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative, a group of trans podcasting badasses working to bring more trans voices into podcasting and other content creation. Search for the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative on Facebook for more info. You can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto. You can email us at podcast@thegaytheistmanifesto.com. I'm on Twitter at GaytheistCallie. You can find the show on Twitter at The Gaytheists. And Ari's got a thing.
Well, as we mentioned at the top of the show, Callie was this weekend in Austin to be on the Atheist Experience, and thanks in large part to our patrons, I was also able to tag along even though I wasn't on the show. Boo for me. So while we were in Texas this weekend, I had an opportunity for some introspection. After spending a lot of time with Callie and with Tracy Harris, that little nugget of something that I had never quite been able to articulate in words before began to emerge to the surface of my consciousness. We spent many hours talking together, discussing trans issues, cross-cultural studies, polyamory, marriage, religious influence in medicine, the influence of our genetics and our parents' teachings, and our personalities, and so on. And after mulling over in my mind the form and structure these conversations took, I had a bit of an epiphany, if you care to use that word to describe it. Although if you've listened to the show for a while, you've probably already figured this out before even I did. And that thing is, I'm fucking blunt. When I have something to say, I just get to the freaking point. And I do not understand how these people can just keep on going and adding more details and delving into tangentially related side stories at a rate of approximately 5 per discrete idea. Like, you could ask me, hey, Ari, what's your favorite movie? And I would say, Spirited Away, and that would be that. But if you ask Callie or Tracy the same question, they would somehow find a way to go on some epic, sprawling narrative journey full of twists, cliffhangers, and humorous asides before they finally reveal several paragraphs later that all of that was simply meant to illustrate that they like the Emoji Movie. And at first,
I was so fucking called out right now.
At first, I was pretty insecure that all my contributions to our conversation lasted 1 or 2 minutes at the most, while Callie and Tracy could keep on going for 10, 15, even 17 million minutes without even pausing to gather their thoughts. Were they being psychically beamed this information from the alien mothership from which they arrived on this planet? Or maybe they were normal, I worried, but I wasn't smart enough to behave similarly, or I didn't have many original or insightful thoughts to contribute. But over time, I realized the world needs Callies and Tracys, and the world also needs Aries, who will just say the damn thing. Is that true? I don't frickin' know, but I'm going to go with that so I don't feel like a failure as a podcaster because I'm not that good at talking. So here's my contact information. Ari Stillman on Facebook, aristillman4@gmail.com. Listen to me on The Cis Are Getting Out of Hand and the SJW Circle Jerk, the latter of which is not a good podcast. The end. God damn.
I will affirm that the world does, in fact, need
Yes.
Aries because we
Indeed.
love our Ari. If you want to support the show and the activism we do, you can head to patreon.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto, make a per episode donation as little as $1 per episode. You can also head over to iTunes, give us a 5-star review that helps us move up in the rankings and get heard by more people. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things, and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is The Gaytheist Manifesto.